Ghana, or back then known as the Gold Coast, is a country on the coast of West Africa with a long history of international trade. Africans in the northern parts of present-day Ghana had strong connections to the North Africa through trade, and were heavily influenced by the Islam. Coastal traders in the south established relationships with Europeans in the 15th century, first trading with gold and ivory, and later becoming involved in the Atlantic slave trade. The British government took control during the 1847 and about 110 years, which is from 1847 to 1957. It is also the first black African nation to gain its independence from the colonial rules. By the end of the 16th century, most ethnic groups constituting the modern Ghanaian population had settled in their present location. Tribes like Ansanti tribe, Mole Gabon tribe, the Fante tribe, Akan tribe, etc. These tribes helped to fund the basics of Ghana economics, which covered up most of the work such as gathering, hunting, fishing, animal husbandry, and milking of domesticated animals and agriculture. Archaeologists found that central Ghana, north of the forest zone, was inhabited as early as 3,000 to 4,000 years old. Unlike most Euro-Asian civilizations, African societies favored oral tradition, and few possessed written languages. Stories and oral histories documented the past, and were handed down from generations to generations. The oral-based linguistic past of African remains promising and problematic in documenting Africans' pre-colonial past, as many of these oral histories have either been forgotten or distorted after being retold by each passing generation. And most of them lived in the forest, in little cabin in the region, and as Europeans described, like animals, but they had their peaceful life and their happy life in their own home. African ethnicities and complied various quantitative indicators reflecting political institution and culture. Ghana itself has a powerful and large kingdom and complex systems, similar to other continents and countries like China and other countries in Europe. Its rulers were renowned for their wealth in gold and their opulence of their courts, and their warriors and their hunting skills. Everything started way back from 1471, when the Portuguese colonized Ghana. The Netherlands and Denmark had influenced and colonialized in the later years, and in 1807 the British came to help them. By the early 19th century, Britain had become the dominant trading power in the region, and in 1874 the British officially proclaimed and formalized their control of the coastal region, which is called the Gold Coast. By making it a colonial protectorate, the British wanted to protect their merchants from the Asante, a powerful African state that controlled the land to the north and had dominated trade in the region for centuries. In the Gold Coast, the British introduced new techniques and procedures to increase trade and maximize their control. Africans continued to produce palm oil, mine gold, and collect ivory for export. But the railroading system of road built by the British made this trade more efficient. Colonial officials established a legislative council including appointed African representatives starting in 1889 and elected African representatives in the beginning of 1925. But this body would only advise the governor. Unlike other colonies, Africans in the Golden Coast often work for themselves or for other Africans. The British appointed a British governor to rule the colony, but largely dependent on the indirect rule, that is, governing through African traditional leaders who took new role as a colonial administrator. The philosophy they use here is definitely indirect rule, which the British people think that it is a very nice way to control the colony, but later on I will explain that it is not the case for Africans. The English-American colonies were autocratic and theocratic, with patriarchal system of justice, ministers, and religious leaders, sometimes one and the same, made the laws, and the burden of obeying them fell on the less exhausted, the tradesmen, soldiers, farmers, servants, slaves, and the youngs. The burden could be weighty. Punishments were almost always public, for the aim was to humiliate the wayward sheep and teach them a lesson so they would repent and be eager to go back to work. First, let me explain what is indirect rule. Indirect rule is a system of governance used by the British and the French to control part of their colonial empires, particularly in Africa and in Asia, through pre-existing local power structures. The essential features were the preservation of traditional political institutions and their adaptation, under the tutelage and direction of the British administration, to the requirements of modern unit of local government. Even though the indirect rule allowed Africans to be ruled by their own traditional leaders, the Africans most probably hated this rule. They see the aim is to change their culture and themselves into who they're not, by changing the elders and the most traditional people in the country first. Changing the elders and the most traditional people and the most respected, meaning changing the country and changing their whole religion and tradition at once. The young didn't have much experience, and they were taught to respect their elders and to listen to them. And this is why they think the British government brainwashed their most respected people around the country so they can be turned into Europeans and whites, and can be turned into a normal people according to the British government. The Africans think that there will be no differences between indirect rule and direct rule. However, they think they even hate indirect rule more because what the British government changed really was its true culture and tradition because of changing the elders. However, the direct rule is only ruling them by a foreign policy and a foreign government and forcing them to change, and they can resist that. But under the ruling, own respected leaders will be even more brutal compared to a direct rule. According to the British people and government, what they wanted the most was their product, and that's why they used indirect rule. They thought working under the rules made by their traditional leaders or even people they're familiar with will be easier for them, and will make the working progress even more convenient. The essential aim, therefore, for British people will be the development of an African society able to participate in the life of modern world as a community in its own right, led by their own leaders. How the British is thinking is that they're being nice to the Africans unlike other colonizers during the period of time, letting them lead by their traditional leaders. The purpose was change their world by their brainwashed leaders. It's less brutal in their mind, and it's better than changing a society by forced labor, by continuously punishment and threatening. However, how Africans sees this is completely the opposite. Changing the elders, or the older generation, meaning a genocide of their tradition, a genocide of their old society, a genocide of the life they want. The younger generations don't have the experience, as I talked about it before, and they don't know the traditions, but the elders does. Changing them, meaning changing the whole world, and the Europeans changing them will provoke the Africans even more by using this indirect rule. Because the British force also control lots of countries and cities in Asia, I feel like their perspectives is also needed to address during this question about African colonization. India, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Philippines, for instance, were part of the British Empire back in the 19th century and the 20th century. India, for example, most of the governance of the region was kept in control of the traditional Indian rulers, who the British administration identified as Indian princes. And these rulers acquired stability and prestige, but lost their anatomy. The Indian citizens hated this. They see their previous traditional leaders and they aren't themselves anymore. They're brainwashed by the British government and forced to change themselves into something they're not. Just like the Africans, the government was changed, but stayed the same. And that pissed them off even more. Just like the Africans, the Asian countries which were used by the British indirect rule got even more pissed because of its rule. This first cartoon you can see is that the European priest is allied with the European soldiers holding a gun at the native people, threatening them. The natives, Africans, are lying on the ground either dying or suffering, and ironically the black skin from their body is peeling off, which is illustrating that the Europeans are changing them into Europeans and white, and trying to change their beliefs, traditions, and their world. And the word in the cartoon said, "Watch the Bible and not my actions," illustrate how Europeans are colonizing. They're fooling themselves that they are actually changing the country or the culture because the Africans want them to do so. But their action is the opposite of what they're doing. They're holding a gun, pointing at their head, and trying to make them change themselves to someone who they're not, and they're suffering. And they're called themselves the settlers, which sounds like a lifesaver. It's also ironic, since the priest is Christian, and they're lying to each other, and they're allying with other European armies, which is threatening people with their lives. The point of view from this cartoon is both perspectives, British and native Africans. It illustrates how brutal life is while under the colonization of Europeans. Meanwhile, shows clearly the other side of Europeans and how they lie to themselves every day to convince themselves that the Africans really wants to change, and they are helping them. The second cartoon here you can see, it explains about the indirect rule of the British system. As you can see, a formally dressed up European soldier is shaking hands with the puppet. What they're calling is the native or traditional leaders of Ghana or other countries. The quote on the bottom says, "You are free now to run the Africa as you see fit." Yes, they are free to rule their own countries, but through a British system and the foreign policies. Even though the Africans are allowed to lead their own people and country, but they are controlled by the British government. And most of the leaders they're allowing them to lead the country are being brainwashed by the government. In another form, only British government is leading the country, but not the traditional leaders anymore. They have completely changed the elders and the leaders and the country itself. This point of view is a little bit both from both perspectives. However, more from the African side. It represents the hunger of the British indirect rule and the pity towards the African people